Take it away, Colette.
All right, let me share screen. All right, and can you see that okay, Bob?
Yes, I can.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we will be talking about local agency formation commissions, otherwise known as LAFCos. And let me see how to advance here. There we go. All right, so my name's Colette Santsche, and I'm a principal planner at Plan West Partners, and we're based in Arcata. And I also serve as contract executive officer for Humboldt and Trinity LAFCos. And then with us today is Krystle Heaney. She's a senior planner at Plan West and has worked with me a long time as a clerk and analyst for Humboldt and Trinity, and recently is the new executive officer for Shasta LAFCo. So excited to have her with us. And just wanted to start with just a very broad and very short LAFCo 101. So for those that don't know much about LAFCos, LAFCos were established by the state legislature in 1963, and it was really in response to World War II, post-World War II population and housing boom, and the need to really have a local commission, not overseen by the state, but a local commission to encourage the orderly formation of local governmental agencies, to preserve ag lands, and discourage urban sprawl. So again, local commission with broad representation. So there's 58 LAFCos, so one in each county, and there's over 3,500 agencies, the majority of those being special districts. And the commission composition varies county by county, but the majority are, it's a 7-member commission typically, and it's 2 county members from the Board of Supervisors, 2 city council members, 2 special district board members, and a member of the public. So again, broad representation. Some counties that varies, like in Del Norte County, there's no special district representation. So I believe the county has 3 commissioners, the city has 3, and there's a public member, or it's something like that. Maybe it's 2, 2, and 2. I don't do Del Norte, but the commission composition does vary. And then in Trinity County, there's no city, so it's just county, special district, and public. Then LAFCO's authority is pretty broad. It's has oversight and boundary changes, like annexations and detachments, and then sphere of influence. So creating and adopting spheres of influence for each city and special district. And in order to really evaluate spheres of influence, we prepare municipal service reviews. And LAFCos do have the power to initiate proposals involving the dissolution or consolidation of special districts in certain instances. There's really strict requirements of, needing a study and needing to make certain findings and a timeline for that. So typically even, consolidations, we want the application to come direct to LAFCO from affected agencies. And then we also oversee out of agency service agreements or extensions of services outside cities and special districts. And then LAFCos adopt their own local policies, and so there's authority for that. And I'm going to pass it to Krystle to speak about more of the regulatory and planning functions of LAFCO.
Well, thanks, Colette, for that introduction. So talking more about our regulatory functions, we are governed by the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Local Government Reorganization Act of 2000. That's a mouthful, so we just call it the CKH Act. Government codes there, if anybody feels like digging into it and is a code nerd. As was mentioned, we're responsible for reviewing and approving changes of organization. So a single action, so incorporation, formation, disincorporation, this whole list, a single one of those would be considered a change of organization. Now, a lot of times we'll get a mix of these different things that are going on. So say one district wants to annex an area that's currently within another district's boundary. So the other district would have to detach. And since we're doing the annexation and the detachment, then it's a reorganization because it's more than one. There are also consolidations or mergers if there's two districts with the same principal act that want to combine and create one larger district. Subsidiary district formations, which can be a little tricky. And then new powers activation. So say you have a community service district that's currently supplying water and wastewater to the community, but they decide that they want to try and make part of their property into a park and accessible to the public. Well, then they would come to LAFCo for an activation of recreation powers so that they can legally go forth and provide that awesome new service to the community. As Colette said, we also go over extension of services outside of jurisdictional boundaries. And we also look at consistency with the adopted spheres of influence, which I'll get into those different types of spheres in just a little bit. So to be very clear, LAFCo does not have land use authority. That is not our job. That is up to other people. So we will not tell you what type of land use you can have, what type of property development or subdivision requirements, none of that. We do consider land use when we're looking at different types of applications. So we'll take a look at the current land use, any future proposed land uses, maybe as part of an application. If say a city's going for a general plan update soon, we'll have a chat with them and see what kind of proposed changes they might be considering for different areas. We also want to take a look at how those land uses can contribute to the future need for service. So if there's an area that maybe changes from a low density residential to a higher density residential, that may create an increased need for service. And we'll be taking a look at what kind of impact that would have on the agency. We also like to take a look at other communities of interest. The most common one is disadvantaged unincorporated communities. So those are areas, it's technical. It's less than 80% of the median household income is that area's median household income. So areas that might be struggling and may not have a huge property tax base, and they're kind of living on the fringes. And we'll want to consider those areas and make sure they're receiving the services that they need. And if there's anything that local agencies might be able to do to help improve those areas. Okay, so boundary types. We deal with two basic boundary types. There's a lot more, but the main ones that we consider are the jurisdictional boundary. So that's where the agency, city or special district has some type of legal authority to implement their adopted rules and regulations. So this could be city code or local policies related to a CSD. Maybe there's what's it called? Covenants, codes, and restrictions for different subdivisions, those sorts of things. So within their jurisdictional boundary, they have the right to enforce those. The other boundary that we look at and we are responsible for setting is the sphere of influence. So as defined in the CKH Act, the sphere of influence, or SOI, is the plan for the probable physical boundaries and service area of a local agency as determined by the commission. So it's our job to keep track of the sphere of influence and set it. It's usually adopted by resolution and kept on file. We have a few different types, which I do have examples for a little bit later on, but they are coterminous, so it would be the same as the jurisdictional boundary. Expanded, which would be larger, and indicates areas where maybe the agency is looking to expand their services in the future. There are some cases of reduced or contracted boundaries, and this is an indication of a future detachment by the agency. And in some cases, we also adopt a zero sphere of influence for an agency, and that indicates that the agency is going to dissolve sometime in the future. So here we have the coterminous sphere of influence. So the blue line here for Trinity Public Utilities District, that is their jurisdictional boundary, and it's also their sphere of influence. So they're pretty set with where they would like to provide services. There is one little hole in there, but for right now, they are pretty content. And so we're keeping it the same. There's no intent to expand service or contract it. So here we have a whole bunch of different boundaries going on, but the one that we want to focus on is the expanded sphere of influence. So for the city of Crescent City, we have the darker black and white dashed line, which is kind of smaller in that map there, and that shows the actual jurisdictional boundary for the city. Now the white colored with the smaller black dashes, that is their adopted sphere of influence. And you can see that it's a lot larger, it's expanded. And so this is an indication that there are areas where they maybe already provide services. So in this instance, I believe it is the county service area shown in the tan color. They process the wastewater for those areas. Or it's areas where they have some sort of planning interest, or they might be looking at expanding services, maybe providing more sewer service, not saying that they are, but that could be an option, or water, or fire, police, whatever they feel may be helpful for that area in the future, or sometimes currently. So that's the expanded sphere that we sometimes adopt. So here we do have a contracted sphere of influence. This is for the Jacoby Creek County Water District in Humboldt County. This is just outside the city limits for the city of Arcata. And originally the district, when it was set up, it had a much larger boundary going down Jacoby Creek Road. That's indicated by the dark blue line there. But they never expanded services down there. They don't intend to. And actually, in this case, the city provides the water and maintenance for the system. And they don't have any future plans to expand further down this road. So we decided to pull back the sphere of influence for this district, and eventually we'll probably be looking at processing a detachment for them, just to help clean up that boundary and make it a little neater. So now we're going to get into the application process, which is really important, and I'm going to hand it back over to Colette.
Excellent. Thanks, Krystle. So just wanted to cover the LAFCo application process briefly. So for any change of organization or reorganization, there is a need to officially apply to LAFCo and process the application. And there's two ways to initiate that. It's by petition. It can either be by a property owner or a registered voter. And there's specific petition requirements in the CKH Act and sometimes also in the Districts Enabling Act. And then there's also the preferred option for ways to initiate an application is by resolution of application by the affected local agency. And this is preferred because it's the agency that is providing the service and needs to be involved in the decision making around that. Also when the local agency would take first action for purposes of environmental review, and LAFCo would serve as a responsible agency instead of lead agency. So those are two ways to initiate an application. Petition, though, we have received those for purposes of like a formation of a district. And so like a fire protection district formation, it would be the registered voters within the proposed district boundary, at least 25% of signatures would need to be collected, and then those are verified by the elections office. And so we have received those in the past. But just some tips for successful application, just early consultation with LAFCo. We're always here and available. Please call us or email. Early outreach to the affected community, and complete that CEQA documentation and other regulatory approvals. And so really a timing consideration that is really important is any other discretionary approvals that may be needed. So for like a city annexation, for example, if they're processing a subdivision just right outside the city, and there's a general plan and zoning amendments and subdivision approval and all of these discretionary approvals, there's likely other responsible agencies that have some sort of oversight in action. And so the city would be the lead agency. They would go through that discretionary review process. LAFCo would be, notified when the environmental, when the CEQA document, likely an EIR, is out for public review. We would comment and review that as responsible agency. So again, in those instances, the application to LAFCo and the timing of that is after all of those discretionary approvals are sought. And then the city in that instance would be applying to LAFCo. And then our application, for a complete application, there's the resolution of application for agencies, agency initiated, a plan for services that accompanies the application. And then a map and a geographic description of the exterior boundaries of the affected territory. And so that geographic description is a meets and bounds, and it needs to meet the Board of Equalization requirements. So there's information we could provide for that. And then the environmental documentation and the filing fee. And then just wanted to touch on a couple of the different types. So activation of powers, this has somewhat of different requirements than, let's say, an annexation application. But for this one, the plan for services has, like I said, additional requirements and the need for an agency to really document, not the type of proposed services being applied for or that they want to activate and provide. Work with their adjacent agencies if there's any overlap or overlapping boundaries, or if another agency is already providing that service. They need to really evaluate the capacity to provide service. And then also very important is the financial ability of an agency to provide service. And so in the LAFCo application, we would possibly, if it's part of the plan for service, and it's really clear that in order to provide that service, a special district, if they wanted to provide like recreation services, they would need to levy and get property owner approval for a special assessment or a special tax. And so we would condition the activation or the power activation on voter approval or property owner approval of that revenue source. And if that is not received and not supported by the community, then that new power would be terminated. Let's see. Oh, maybe I skipped one. Okay, and this is a slide on out of agency services. We receive a lot of inquiries about new or expanded services outside of boundaries. And this typically occurs because there's sometimes an existing water line that was extended decades ago, and it goes right in front of someone's house, and they're like, oh, our well, is acting up and we don't want to put the money into fixing it. Can we just connect? Other times it's for a failed septic tank, and it's feasible to extend a water main to their property. So we get some of these health and safety inquiries quite a bit. And the CKH Act more or less says that, LAFCO's approval is required for any extension of services outside of agency boundaries, and that, that extension can occur within a sphere in anticipation of a later change of organization. So basically annexation, but it doesn't really provide much concrete information or requirements for when that should happen. And then it can also extend services outside of the sphere of influence in response to an existing or impending threat to public health or safety. So these kind of are the thresholds. So spheres of influence are really important again, and also, really documenting whether annexation is practical. And sometimes there are situations where annexation, isn't possibly practical at the time, or there's local circumstances where it might not make sense at the time. So, but generally annexations are preferred. And then we can talk a little bit more about the planning functions of LAFCo, and I will pass this back to Krystle.
Right. So LAFCo as a planner, our government code states in part, blah, 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 blah. It's there. You can read it. Basically, we want to do some plans and studies to help inform decisions, especially in regards to our two main functions, which are to protect agricultural land and discourage urban sprawl. So how we accomplish this planning is largely done through our municipal service reviews and sometimes special studies. Municipal service reviews, that is a big chunk of what we do at LAFCo. So these are a snapshot of the agency, and we like to conduct them, along with spheres of influence, which are supposed to be updated every 5 years, but depending on how many agencies are in a county, it can be more into the 8 to 10 year range, just because a lot of work goes into these documents. So as part of the municipal service review, we take a look at the agency's current services. So what types of services they're providing, what level of service, is anything going really well? Are there some areas where they're potentially struggling? And see how the community is being provided overall with these services. We'll also take a look at the, you just go back for a second, thanks. We also take a look at the agency's finances. We try to look at 5 years so we can identify different trends. Do they have enough revenues to cover their expenses? Are they able to put a little bit aside every year? Are they meeting their reporting requirements? And the reporting requirements are usually a big one, especially for smaller districts, because they just don't know. So we like to use the MSRs as a way to educate not only the agencies, but also public members on the different types of reports that are supposed to be submitted and made available to the public. Okay, go for it. In addition to MSRs, we can also do special studies. Now, sometimes these are done by LAFCo and sometimes these are done by interested stakeholder groups. Here is an example of the Beckworth Peak Fire Protection District formation. This was over in Plumas County. And this was a group of people that were concerned about fire services in the area and whether or not there was a better way to provide those services. So again, these can help inform LAFCo decisions about annexations, consolidations, formations. So maybe there's an area where they're being served by a volunteer fire company and donations have been going down in recent years. And so we want to do a study to see if it would be feasible to form a new fire protection district so that they have the ability to get some regular funding to support those services. There we go. So those are our two different planning documents that we use on a general basis. So now we'll dig a little bit into water and wastewater services. Go for it. So throughout the multitude of MSRs that we've conducted, we do look a lot at water and wastewater. In Humboldt County, we recently completed the South County Water Wastewater MSR. So we looked at 8 different agencies in Southern Humboldt to see how they were doing, what's going on, what kind of trends we can see throughout the area. So the common themes that we came across were, again, the reporting requirements. So for these types of services, you can get consumer confidence reports for your water, and that's done on an annual basis, and that's something the agency is supposed to provide to the state and all of their ratepayers. But then there's also a ton of other state reporting and monitoring requirements. You're supposed to be out there testing your water on a very regular basis and providing all that data to the state. And when you're looking at some really small agencies, like we had one, I think that was only 35 connections, and they didn't have any staff. It was all done by volunteers. There's not time, there's not money, and there's just not knowledge about all these different reporting requirements. On the financial side, there are annual reports that need to be submitted to the state controller's office. And then for different agencies, you're required to adopt an annual budget and submit that to the county auditor. And you're also supposed to provide regular audits. Typically, we like to see annual audits, but for these smaller agencies, you can always adopt a biannual audit. So you're doing it every 2 years instead of every year. And that helps a little bit with the cost and also the amount of time and effort that goes into producing this large financial document. The other theme we saw was staffing concerns. As I mentioned, there are agencies that are run completely by volunteers. Some there's only a couple of employees. You might have one operator and one administrative person that does all of the office stuff. So billing, coordinating with customers, running meetings, all that stuff. Certified operators was another thing that we found was difficult to come by. For more remote areas, it could be hard to come by a certified operator. And for specifically wastewater systems, because they can be so different, a lot of times you have to train on that specific system and then become certified, just so that you know all the ins and outs and how to operate it correctly. In accounting professionals, I mentioned audits are supposed to be done on a regular basis, and there's actually a lack of people that can do that. Sometimes you'll call up a CPA and will say, no, I'm sorry, I'm booked, I don't have time. You might be able to try this other person, and you go through several different ones before you can find someone that can pencil you in and get your audit done. So those were more administrative sides that we saw were some common themes. On the more infrastructure and actual operational side, we found that for water and wastewater districts, funding is a huge issue. And I think that's probably true for a lot of agencies, but specifically funding to address aging infrastructure. Some of these systems were put in the 60s and 70s, and they're still running on the same pipes, and pipes are getting old and starting to crack, leak, and in some cases burst. And it's hard to find funding to continue the maintenance on those types of systems and then replace them when you need to. So different things we saw were outdated rate schedules that just don't provide enough funding for capital improvement projects or for staffing to provide all of that administrative support that we talked about. There's a need for regular rate studies. So typically when you have a study done, it's for 5 years. So every, 5, maybe 7 years, you want to be looking at a new rate study. And that's something that you need to plan for financially so that you can get that funded. And then there are technical assistance offerings. So there's I believe it's the North Coast Resource Partnership that can provide technical assistance to a lot of different smaller agencies. And sometimes they just don't know that that's out there. And so in other counties and regions, it's important for LAFCo to help provide that type of information and let these agencies know where they can potentially get help. The other area that we were looking at was grant funding for all these different infrastructure projects. So there's different stages: planning, design, and then actual construction, and you'll need funding for all three of those. And in order to receive grants, you typically require up-to-date financial audits or different types of financial documentation to show that you're staying on top of your finances and you have the ability to manage these funds. And as a smaller agency, or maybe an agency that just doesn't know, if you don't have those audits, sometimes you won't get your grants. You also need to show an ability to successfully manage the project. And again, that comes to the administrative support side of things and staffing. It takes a lot to make sure you're keeping up on all the reporting and the different types of invoices that need to be submitted for reimbursement, and and just all the different requirements that go along with the grant. There's a ton. And sometimes it's just the ability to even write the grant. If you've never written a grant before, you might be looking at all these requirements and going, oh my gosh, I have no idea what's going on. So those are different things that we found throughout our water and wastewater MSRs.
All right, thanks,
And
Krystle.
I'll pass it back to Colette,
Yeah,
because she is the queen of fire services.
excellent. Yeah, and I think it's, very similar trends in fire service as well, just lack of capacity. And so that's where we've been doing a lot of fire services planning in Humboldt and in Trinity as well. And there's specific themes for fire, and a lot of that comes with just the nature of volunteer and volunteerism, and just challenges with recruitment and retention, and just rising costs of training and certification of volunteers. And a lot of districts are providing services outside of their jurisdictional boundary, especially for fire. There's large goodwill response areas where they're not receiving revenue, but where demands, service demands, continue based on just how housing and development has housing and development patterns over time happening outside of fire district boundaries. And then there's just equipment costs and just costs for running a fire department, and all of these things make it really challenging. In Humboldt County, here's a map that it's kind of hard to see, but all the green is where there's a fire district. All the red is where there is goodwill response happening by fire districts, and they're not getting reimbursed for services. The yellow is non-district response areas. So those are like the bake sale companies and volunteer fire companies not associated with the district. And then we have tribal fire departments as well. We've made actually really good progress. This map had a lot more red and yellow on it in the 5 or more years ago, and we've slowly been processing fire district formations and fire district annexations and consolidations. And so LAFCo's role, I think, for fire services, we do a lot of technical assistance, and we serve on a technical assistance team working really closely with Humboldt County and the Fire Chiefs Association and a Humboldt County Board of Supervisors Fire Services ad hoc. So there's a lot of goodwill and coordination happening. In Humboldt County, we're very lucky to have a property tax exchange policy to support annexation and consolidation. And so if there's any questions about that, please reach out after. But yeah, we meet a lot with fire departments and talk about, their needs and really crunch numbers, like look at how many parcels that are outside of their boundaries that they could potentially annex, and how much revenue that could generate if they extend their special tax or assessment, or if they haven't updated their tax or assessment. We really work closely with them to look at what it could generate if they increased a special tax, and just really help them through the process of thinking about that. So just a lot of coordination. It's very slow, but we've been making progress, and that's what matters. And then just trends generally here, I guess, this is speaking the same thing, but it's all about building capacity, addressing service and boundaries and funding needs. Here's just some of the formations. We formed Bryceland, Bridgeville, Fruitland Ridge, and Salmon Creek fire protection districts in recent years in Humboldt. Rio Dell was the first to jump to do a really large annexation and consolidate with the Scotia. There was like 3 or 4 different volunteer fire companies in the area providing services, and they all came under the fire protection, Rio Dell Fire Protection District umbrella, and are working together under more of a battalion structure, which is really awesome. Garberville was the second. They did a large annexation from their existing district all the way to the South County line, and including Benbow, a very, an area that has grown over time, but did not have fire service coverage. And it's, there was a large support from that community to be annexed and to support the special tax that was proposed. And that special tax was a condition of LAFCo approval for the annexation. And then outside of, our LAFCo area, but in Plymouth County, we assisted on a feasibility study for a reorganization that included formation and consolidation for 4 agencies, including a city, a CSD, and 2 fire districts. That included a property tax exchange negotiation for tax increment that was outside of any fire-related district, so they were picking up like the no man's land. And then also a new special tax for the new fire district that received voter approval. And again, all of the formations, all of the annexations contingent on voter approval, or if they do have a strong special tax or assessment in place, a condition of LAFCo approval for an annexation would be extension of that special tax to the annexation area, providing them the funding to serve that area. All right, I know that Allison was super into the incorporation question, so we'll jump into that. So over the years, we've received some questions about incorporation. I remember in Southern Humboldt, there were some residents in the Garberville area that really wanted to incorporate. I've received calls in the Hayfork area that, interest in incorporating. Again, there's no incorporated cities in Trinity County. The 2 that I think, seems like I think people would feel like they're already cities would be Weaverville and Hayfork. Those are the 2 largest, but no, they're not cities. They're unincorporated. But here's some of the newest cities. There's not a lot of incorporations happening these days. And so since like 2008, there were 4 in Riverside County. And then there was recently, this year, the Mountain House Incorporation in San Joaquin County. So definitely the pace of incorporations are slowing. Oh, and so, sorry, before I forget, the most recent incorporation exploration that's happening is in McKinleyville, north of Arcata. And so this is one of the fastest growing communities in Humboldt County. And for many years, I think there's been studies about incorporation and, interest in proceeding, but then, for some reason, there's a loss of interest in it, and that planning stops, and then it gets picked up again. And today there's a group of residents that are meeting regularly and working to explore incorporation. And it is being supported by the McKinleyville the McKinleyville group, and it's called the McKinleyville Incorporation Exploration Subcommittee. And so I've been meeting with them regularly. And so one question is, why become a city? And most of the time, it's the local control over land use and services, or being able to potentially have additional funding mechanisms to provide additional services. But really it's, to create local accountability and have, a city council for your community and have that land use control. And here's just the basic process. It starts with initial feasibility, and this is where McKinleyville is. The Cal Poly Humboldt commissioned a study to explore incorporation, but it hasn't even reached this initial feasibility analysis point yet. So to be an initial feasibility analysis, it's really looking at the revenues and the expenditures, and working closely to, project and have some initial idea of the boundaries and maybe some different boundary configurations, and then the revenues and expenditures for those different boundary configurations. So they're not even to the IFA yet, but they are trying to figure out how to fund the IFA. And then with that, they're talking about how to engage the community, how to get correct information out there, because, there is a lot of misinformation that can spread about incorporation, or why it's necessary, or why it's even being discussed. A lot of detractors at times. And so fundraising may be needed, or some sort of affected agency or, community group to really see the benefit and to pursue this. Once there's, it's deemed feasible in concept, then a LAFCo application can be submitted. Again, this would be either by petition, and you would need 25% of registered voters within the proposed incorporation and proposed city to sign the petition, or you would need a resolution of the affected county or a affected district. And so in McKinleyville, theoretically, the McKinleyville Community Services District that currently provides water, wastewater, and recreation services could be the one to, in theory, reorganize and become a city and provide expanded services. So they could be the one to initiate. The County of Humboldt could also, as a affected agency, initiate the application to LAFCo. As of right now, neither of those agencies have expressed interest to take that role. And then once an application is submitted, then LAFCo really takes the lead, at that point in processing the application, doing the noticing, holding the hearings. And with that, is doing a comprehensive fiscal analysis, which we will talk about more, and if by petition, serving as lead agency for CEQA. There's an election if LAFCo approves the incorporation, and there would be a ballot question for registered voters within the affected territory to vote for or against incorporation, and 50% or more of the registered voters would need to support it for it to pass. With that would be any conditions, or tax levies that would be required to make it feasible, which would be conditions of LAFCo approval. And then on the ballot would be, candidates for the initial city council. And then if passed the election process, then there would be the new city and there would be new, the new officials would be seated. They would start adopting the ordinances, adopting their budget, and slowly transition from the county to the new city, and slowly hiring staff and transitioning the land use approvals and municipal codes from the county to the city. There's a high cost for all of this, and it's really hard to determine what that would be just for the LAFCo application process, for the comprehensive fiscal analysis, for the environmental review. Likely there would need to be a lot of outreach, which has costs for proponents and polling. Then there's the election cost. So, I mean, easily, I think 100,000 isn't even like nearly enough. So it would probably be more like 200 plus. And really the cost can escalate depending on the complexity and the controversy of the application. Here's a slide for the comprehensive fiscal analysis. It's really diving really deep into the revenues and expenses and determining the feasibility. Again, the initial feasibility or initial fiscal analysis would do that. And so this would be the comprehensive fiscal analysis would be taking that initial feasibility analysis and confirming and even going into more detail. For those agencies, or not agencies, for those that have gone through incorporation feasibility, like Mountain House, they had one consultant do the initial feasibility analysis and a separate consultant do the comprehensive. And I think, that's really important to have two different eyes on the fiscal projections and the revenue neutrality arrangements. And with that, let's talk about revenue neutrality. So this is one that makes incorporation, challenging, and a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their brain about what is revenue neutrality. But so any proposal that includes incorporation would need to result in a similar exchange of both revenue and responsibility for service delivery among the county, the proposed city, and other subject agencies. And so it really serves to minimize the long-term negative fiscal impacts that incorporations have on counties. And LAFCo may approve a proposal that includes incorporation if it finds that the county and all the subject agencies agree to the proposed transfer, or that the negative fiscal effects have been adequately mitigated by tax sharing agreements, lump sum payments, and payments over a fixed period of time, and or other terms and conditions. So really, I mean, the county has, and all the affected agencies have to be at the table. And this is where, sometimes there can be disagreements about, the methodology or the revenue neutrality considerations. And it's one of the most important but challenging hurdles to the incorporation process. All right, I think I'm going to leave it here and open it up for questions. I should have our contact information here, but we don't, so we can send that out afterwards. And I think I will stop share at this time.
Well, thank you, Colette. That was great. And I suppose you would like to do an incorporation and add to your resume?
That would be so cool. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's been really great meeting with the with this group. They have been asking all the right questions and are really trying to explore all options, and looking at the boundary and what areas should or should not be included. McKinleyville's has its own challenges because it's in the coastal zone, so and then even there can be a transition of services. So could the city first incorporate providing limited services or by contract with the county? So for sheriff, they could provide that service with a contract with the county to start with. And then maybe water and wastewater, they've talked about not being included and keep McKinleyville CSD for a time being until, there's this transition, and then it makes sense to bring in those services. So there can be a slow transition to cityhood, and I think that's kind of what they're looking at.
Good. So for our attendees, if you have any questions, do use the question answer. Meanwhile, let's see. So when you have two entities that want to annex the same area, is there something that you do to decide which one? Is there a ranking, like our cities given preference over community service?
Yeah, actually there is some code. There's some priority there, and I do believe it's city and then down into special districts, or those that are providing services, or have some associated responsibility for that area. I've never had two agencies vying for annexation at the same time. Typically, it's one agency that is proposing annexation, and then maybe an agency that has their concerns, or wants to make sure that either has some concerns, and we just need to work closely to make sure that those concerns are addressed.
I know you mentioned the fire districts, which I think is a new review for LAFCo. Do you see are there other changes or trends that you see coming forward in the near future for LAFCo?
I mean, fire is a huge one, I think, for all LAFCos. Just going to like the LAFCo conferences. I presented on fire services at the last Cal LAFCo workshop and received a lot of questions and people afterwards, and different LAFCos. It's just a common, fire districts are struggling, and volunteer districts especially, and there's just a real need to consolidate and not continue to, so each district, you think about just, our county, there's over 20 fire protection districts, and then there's other volunteer fire companies, and they're all struggling in the same way. They're having a hard time recruiting new board members. They're having a hard time paying for audits. Their insurance for their fire stations sometimes are skyrocketing. Like they're all dealing with the same thing. They're all having recruitment and retention problems. So it's looking at consolidation, but they're all working together. But it's hard for them to start thinking about consolidation and their their identity with their department. And so it's working through a slow discussion about what a regional district would look like, and how the agency and board structure and governance structure would be, and a staffing structure that would allow for battalions and allow for their department identity to continue. Those are the types of things we're discussing, but it's really slow. It takes a fire district or a person, a champion that really sees the benefit to consolidation to really move it forward, we're finding.
We
But
did
they're out
have
there.
a couple questions. Thank you for that answer.
Mm-hmm.
So does an agency or LAFCo initiate the municipal service reviews?
It can be both. LAFCo typically, if an agency is proposing a sphere of influence amendment or an update on their own, like they want to, maybe like a city has gone through a general plan update, and in their general plan update, they've evaluated, their sphere of influence, and they want to, as part of the general plan update, environmental review, they, included all of that. So they would, once they approved their EIR, they would apply to LAFCo for a sphere of influence amendment. And with that, likely there would need to be an updated municipal service review that would be funded through them.
Otherwise, you look at the 5 to 8 year range
Mm-hmm.
to see if
Yeah.
the update.
Yeah, and so Krystle talked about it before. The code does say for spheres of influence that they need to be updated every 5 years or as necessary. Our local policy for like Humboldt, we have 53, 54, districts, and our service reviews are very comprehensive. They're becoming more and more comprehensive. We're trying to do regional service reviews like regional fire or regional water, to try to lump districts together, and but sometimes those can take longer because you're trying to coordinate with multiple districts. But so we're more on like the 8 to 10 year cycle for sphere updates. And then we, try to accommodate districts that, maybe they're looking at an annexation and they need an expedited sphere review. So we're just trying to stay flexible.
Another question about what does property tax exchange mean?
Property tax exchange is part of the ad valorem 1%. So that's the Prop 13. And luckily in Humboldt, for all the cities, there's master tax sharing agreements between the cities and the county. So when an annexation occurs for the cities, there's not a whole negotiation process happening, and it's really streamlined. In other counties, that's not the case. Like in Mendocino, I understand that there's some negotiations and they're trying to develop those master tax sharing agreements so it doesn't slow down an annexation process. For special districts, typically there's not master. For water and wastewater related districts, some of those, like some CSDs predate Prop 13, so some do receive a small share of ad valorem within their district boundaries, because they were collecting property taxes before that Prop 13 took place. If they were to annex today, likely they would not receive property taxes within the annexation area because they're enterprise related districts and they need to rely on water and wastewater fees. For fire protection districts, this one's challenging in a lot of counties because the counties don't specifically have the responsibility to provide community fire protection. And so they don't feel that when an annexation takes place that they need a share in base exchange or provide a share in property taxes. And fortunately in our county, for Humboldt, the Board of Supervisors really, after decades of fire annexations not happening because of property tax, districts would not annex without a property tax sharing agreement. But then development was continuing to occur out of district, like in Benbow. And so I think the county really recognized that they had a role in the problem of allowing development outside of fire districts over time and how that impacts fire districts. And then also the Subdivision Map Act does not allow subdivisions unless it's in a fire district. So there were different kind of levers that were happening and pressures, I think, and just recognition that this was really needed. And so the Board of Supervisors in Humboldt did pass a policy to support base exchange and tax increment growth for annexation areas and consolidations. But they really want to see, and it's part of their policy, that districts do not only rely on property taxes. There's some fire districts like Garberville Fire Protection District that proposed annexation of the Benbow. They were relying solely on property taxes within their small little district that was like just the Garberville downtown community area. They did not have a special tax. They did not have an assessment. So part of the process, we helped them. And part of the LAFCo conditional approval was for property tax exchange and for a special tax. And so now they have a more diversified revenue portfolio, and they're really able to look to the future. They want to now construct a station in the Benbow area, and that's planned. And then they want to hire some daytime battalion, daytime staffing, and really they're just building capacity for service in that region.
Great. Gary, did you have a question?
Yeah, just kind of relating back to the potential incorporation of the unincorporated community of McKinleyville. I was interested if you could expand a little bit on the revenue neutrality requirements and how that would affect sales tax that's currently generated in that area.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not the revenue neutrality expert. And so I don't know if I can go into sales tax particularly. I think that is a really good question about how exactly like the split with sales tax would be, or if if the sales tax would transfer to the new city and would be a big part of the revenue loss for the county. So I think
Yeah,
all of that's calculated.
sure.
And then, you know, whether there needs to be the lump sum payment over time to make up and mitigate that loss to the county, all of that's part of it. So I think, yes, there would be a loss for sales tax to the county, and it would need to be, it's part of that revenue neutrality calculation.
Okay, it'd have to be offset in some way or another,
Yeah.
potentially over time.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks. Great presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Colette.
Awesome. Oh yeah, we're over. Well, thanks everyone for the questions, and sorry for not having my email, but maybe we can send that out. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.
It's great. Thank you. And thank you, attendees. We'll keep in touch on our next programs soon.
Great. Have a good rest of your week.
Likewise.